Good evening and welcome. My name is Catherine Ramirez, and I'm Associate Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies and Director of the Chicano Latino Research Center at UC Santa Cruz. On behalf of the CLRC, as we're known, and UCSC's Institute for Humanities Research, I want to thank you for joining us at our final off-campus event for non-citizenship, a year-long series in which we've explored what it means to be a citizen and a non-citizen in a world made by migrants, refugees, workers, slaves, prisoners, detainees, the stateless, and denizens. My colleagues and I organized non-citizenship around three themes. In the fall, the theme was forced migration. Last quarter, it was labor mobility and precarity. And this quarter, we're focusing on what we are calling the fluidity of status, the ways in which individuals move between places and statuses, including citizen and non-citizen, migrant and worker, and denizen and stateless person. When we began planning this series a couple of years ago, we had no idea that we would realize it during the Trump presidency. In this moment of proposed border walls, attempted travel bans, and calls to make America or Russia or France or Turkey great again, we see that both the categories of citizen and non-citizen are in crisis, and our conversations are timelier than ever. Since 1992, the Chicano Latino Research Center has supported scholarship in Chicano, Latino, Latin American, and migration studies. In addition, we bridge the campus and community via gatherings like this one. Similarly, the Institute for Humanities Research, also known as the IHR, serves as an incubator for new ideas and provides crucial support to faculty and students at UC Santa Cruz at every stage of the research process. Over the past 2 years, I've been very fortunate to have worked with and counted on the CLRC's and IHR's hardworking and trustworthy staff. In particular, I thank Jackie Powell, who's back there flitting about, Evan Guy, Irene Polic, and Jessica Guild. I also, And thanks to all of the IHR students who are here, and to Alma Villa and Alina Fernandez of the CLRC. I also thank Sheldon Kamenicki, Dean of UCSC's Social Sciences Division, and Bill Lagisaw, former Dean of the Humanities Division at UCSC, for their support. I'm grateful to UCSC's Office of Research, Division of Graduate Studies, and my own department, the Latin American and Latino Studies Department. I am also grateful for, I thank the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History for being an exemplary community partner, our caterer, Mediterranean Grill and Go, for feeding us so well. There's food downstairs, there's food upstairs. If you go upstairs, I highly recommend the Hung Lu exhibit, We Who Work. And I am grateful to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for its generous underwriting. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues, Professors Silvana Falcon, Steve McKay, Juan Poblete, and Felicity Amaya Schaeffer for their vision and teamwork. This evening's program will unfold as follows. Professor Tanya Golash-Boza will present Deported Without Due Process, Ryan's Story. Professor Rhacel Parreñas will follow with The Unfree Labor of Migrant Domestic Workers. After their brief presentations, we'll welcome questions and comments from you, the members of the audience. If you have a question or comment, please write it on one of the note cards that I don't know if they have been distributed or if they will be distributed. IHR and CLRC staff have note cards. Welcome. For your questions. And Professor Felicity Amaya Schaeffer will moderate the Q&A. Professor Schaeffer is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at UC Santa Cruz and author of Love and Empire, Cyber Marriage and Citizenship Across the Americas. Her current project is on surveillance technologies and the sexual criminalization of migrant borders on and beyond the US-Mexico border. Professor Tanya Golash-Boza, right here, is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced. Her numerous publications are on such subjects as detention, deportation, and due process, race and racisms, the parallels between mass incarceration and mass deportation, and Blackness in Peru. Her edited volume, Forced Out and Fenced In, Immigration Tales from the Field, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press next year. And Professor Rhacel Parreñas is Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California, an internationally renowned scholar of migration, labor, and gender. She's authored many articles and books and has held invited visiting appointments at universities around the world. Her 3 current projects are on South Korea's rapid economic ascension, labor relations and legal status in the United Arab Emirates and Singapore, and gender, migration, and the work of care. All 3 of these authors' books are available at the table in the back over there. You can talk to Elias from the Bay Tree Bookstore about purchasing them. Please join me in welcoming Professors Tanya Golash-Boza and Rhacel Parreñas to Santa Cruz. Welcome.
Good evening. In 2009, I carried out a research project that involved interviewing 147 deportees in 4 countries. One of the deportees I met, who I will call Ryan, was living outside of Kingston, Jamaica, in the house of a distant relative. So I want to share his story with you today, as it's emblematic of many of the problems with immigration law enforcement today. So Ryan moved to Brooklyn, New York, when he was 6 years old. There, he finished high school and enrolled in college. Things were going well for Ryan until he made one mistake that would change his life. When Ryan was about 20 years old, he received a phone call from a friend who asked him for a ride home. On their way home, they encountered a police checkpoint. It turned out Ryan's friend was carrying cocaine. Ryan and his friend were found guilty of drug possession, and Ryan was sentenced to 18 months in boot camp in lieu of going to state prison. When he was released from boot camp, they had a graduation. His mother, his fiancée, his daughter came to pick him up at the graduation. However, Ryan did not go home with his family. Ryan was a legal, permanent resident of the United States, and he had been convicted of possession of narcotics, so he faced mandatory and automatic deportation to Jamaica, the country of his birth. Now, Ryan had been in the United States for nearly 2 decades. He had no family he knew in Jamaica. Now, he qualified for citizenship via naturalization as a legal permanent resident. And he actually had applied when his green card expired in 1996. His mother and cousin applied at the same time. His mother's citizenship went through, then his cousin's citizenship went through. So he went to check on his application. The citizenship office told him he needed to redo his fingerprints. he finally received a letter saying he should go to the swearing-in ceremony in 2001, 5 years after he had applied for citizenship. Unfortunately, that was a few weeks after he had been arrested. So he was in jail when his letter arrived. So at the age of 25, Ryan was deported to a country he barely knew. Ryan was deported because he and his mother waited too long for him to apply for citizenship, because he had qualified for citizenship since he was 11. Then there was an unexpected delay in his citizenship application. There was a glut of applications in 1996, and he fell in the midst of that. So a bureaucratic mishap turned into a lifetime punishment for Ryan. So Article 13 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, known in the human rights community as the ICCPR, which the United States has ratified, states, an alien lawfully in the territory of a state may be expelled therefrom only in pursuance of a decision reached in accordance with the law, and shall, except when compelling reasons of national security otherwise require, be allowed to submit the reasons against his expulsion and to have his case reviewed by a competent authority. Now, because Ryan faced mandatory deportation, he did not have the chance to submit the reasons against his expulsion. He was not given a chance to explain that his citizenship application was unduly delayed, that he had an infant daughter, that his mother would be on her own were he to be deported, nor that he had no friends or family in Jamaica, the country he had left when he was 6 years old. Now, Ryan, a legal permanent resident of the United States, could be deported due to laws passed in 1996. Since the implementation of these laws, over 5 million people have been deported from the United States. Now, the current period is exceptional insofar there has never previously been a time in our history when so many people were deported from this country. That's 5 million people since 1997. It's a huge number. It's over twice the sum total of every single person deported between 1892 and 1995. The details of these numbers are often the subject of debate, but no matter how you slice it, we are, and we have been, for 20 years, in a prolonged moment of mass deportation. And the effects of this policy are felt throughout immigrant communities in the United States and throughout where we send deportees in Latin America. A recent survey revealed that over a quarter of Latinos in the United States know someone who has been deported or detained in the past year. This means the effects of deportation are reverberating far beyond these 5 million individual deportations. In 2012, 188,000 people who were living in the United States were apprehended by immigration law enforcement agents and deported to their countries of birth. That's 6 times as many of those kinds of removals as there were in 2003. So an interior removal or deportation, an interior deportation refers to someone like Ryan, who was living in the United States and then is deported to their country of birth. Over the past decade, over 200,000 people who had lived in the United States for more than 10 years were removed from this country. That amounts to the city of Rochester, New York, being depleted of its population over the course of a decade, or perhaps more accurately, Imagine every father in San Francisco being removed from this country. Last year, about 100,000 parents of U.S. citizens were deported. Not only is mass deportation on the rise, it also targets specific populations. About 90% of deportees have been men, and nearly all, 98%, are from the Americas, even though about half of all non-citizens are women, and only 60% of immigrants in this country are from the Americas. Jamaican and Dominican legal permanent residents who are Black immigrants who often live in inner cities are 5 times as likely to be deported as other legal permanent residents. So mass deportation often happens with minimal due process. In 2009, 231 immigration judges heard more than 300,000 cases, an average of over 1,200 cases per year per judge. Today, immigration courts are so backlogged, there's a delay of 2 years. Dana Marks, an immigration judge here in San Francisco, explained that immigration hearings often feel like holding death penalty cases in traffic court. Immigration court is a bit like traffic court. It's an administrative court without the due process protections of criminal courts. In immigration proceedings, you have no right to legal representation. You can be detained without bond. You can be deported without a full hearing. Ryan, for example, never got to tell a judge that he had come to the United States when he was 6, that he qualified for and had applied for citizenship, that he was a college student, that his daughter had just been born, or that he knew no one in Jamaica. The 1996 laws took away most of judges' discretionary power in aggravated felony cases, like Ryan's. Those convicted now face mandatory and automatic deportation, no matter the extenuating circumstances. Even legal permanent residents like Ryan, who have lived in the United States for decades, have extensive family ties in this country, are subject to deportation for relatively minor crimes. Every day, hundreds of parents of U.S. citizens are deported. Some, like Ryan's child, are cared for by a single mother. Others return to the parent's country of birth. Yet thousands of these children end up as orphans and in the foster care system. These children, these U.S. citizen children, grow up in this country knowing that the government took one or both of their parents. How will these children feel about this country when they're of age? How do we make sense of this? Why is the United States deporting more people than ever before in our history? Why are Black and Latino men targeted? And why are deportation laws so draconian? In my work, I argue that mass deportation is best understood as an instance of racialized state repression, a practice that has a long history in this country. The racialized and gendered nature of immigration law enforcement, specifically the targeting of Black and Latino men, should be unsurprising to anyone familiar with the history of state repression in the United States. The enslavement of African Americans, the internment of the Japanese, and the mass repatriation of Mexicans in the 1930s were all official state practices that targeted specific ethnic and racial groups. Now, in today's political climate of colorblind racism, it's unacceptable to have a policy that officially targets one group We couldn't have a Mexican deportation policy on paper, but we certainly can have one in practice, because it is legal and acceptable to our society to have a policy that in its implementation produces disparate outcomes. Insofar as deportation laws are colorblind in their language, it is legally permissible that they are discriminatory in practice. It is thus well beyond time to change the course of history. Thank you.
So let me start by thanking Kat Ramirez. Is this on? Okay. For inviting me to share my work with you. So I'm going to talk about migrant domestic workers globally. So we are seeing this turn towards the recognition of domestic work in general. And so two signs towards this positive turn is first the passage in 2011 of the ILO Convention 189, otherwise known as the Decent Work for Domestic Work Convention. And that convention basically tried to formalize our recognition of domestic work globally. And that the passage of that convention actually led to many receiving countries of migrant domestic workers to revisit their laws. It led, for example, to the recognition of the need for a day off for domestic workers in Lebanon and likewise in Singapore. And so a second sign that we're seeing sort of the formal recognition of domestic work is the allocation of a domestic worker visa. And so across the globe, women from poorer countries usually can go to different countries and basically get legal status by getting employed as a domestic worker. And so the countries where they come from are diverse. They include countries in Eastern Europe, such as Ukraine and Poland. They also come from Latin America, for example, Peruvians who go to Madrid, Mexicans who come to the US or Canada. But they also include domestic workers from Africa, Kenyans and Ethiopians who go primarily to the Middle East, and also domestic workers from Southeast Asia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Indonesia, and they primarily go to Asia, but they also go to the Middle East, and Filipinos go to 160 countries and destinations across the globe. And so of all these domestic workers, the largest group are actually Indonesians, numbering at about 2.4 million, and they're concentrated in Saudi Arabia. And the next largest are Filipinos, which are about 1.4 million in number. And so despite this recognition of domestic work they're seeing, what's interesting about them is that you see this stall in the recognition. And that's because across the globe, migrant domestic workers, when they enter these countries as workers with servant visas, they're actually not considered independent workers, but instead they're constructed as household dependents. Across the globe, migrant domestic workers share the status of being bound laborers or unfree workers. And so what does this mean? It basically means that when they enter a country as a domestic worker, they are legally bound to only work for their sponsor. They're also legally required to work for their sponsor. And third is they do not have flexibility to change sponsors in varying degrees. So we can actually add like a fourth condition to this, which is that across the globe, they also can never really get out of this status and transition to permanent residency, because across the globe, they also do not qualify to transition to become a green card holder, a permanent resident, or a citizen of that country. Historically, only Canada allocated that right to domestic workers, but they actually rescinded that right in 2014. And so then basically, bound laborers, you can say, are the quintessential unfree labor of the 21st century. So when we think of bound laborers, as these unfree workers, we think that they just end up in these places that we imagine are barbaric. So we think of countries in the Middle East that we hear in the media, like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Sometimes we'll hear stories about their abuse in Singapore, Hong Kong. But we never think of the fact that this status is actually something that are also shared by domestic workers in Scandinavian destinations such as Denmark. It's also actually shared by those who enter the United States with a servant visa, and those are domestic workers who are working for expats who return from working abroad, domestic workers of diplomats, and also domestic workers who work in the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and other such large multinational organizations. And this status actually is also shared by those who end up in Canada. So then I just want to stress that this is a global status that domestic workers share. So while I actually emphasize that, I do want to recognize that there are variations in labor standards across destinations. And so there is a hierarchy of destinations in which domestic workers would prefer to still end up in a destination such as Canada and Israel. And that's because they get paid more in those destinations. They also are less likely to work longer hours. And so, for example, in Canada, they are protected by labor laws. And so domestic workers usually work no more than 8 hours a day. In contrast, in countries like the United Arab Emirates or Singapore, domestic workers have a right to 8 hours of rest per day, which basically means employers could actually require domestic workers to work 16 hours a day. And so then the type of employment they do is also quite different. And so in Taiwan and Israel, they're concentrated in doing elderly care work, while in the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other destinations in those regions, they are what you could call an all-around. And then lastly, as you see in this last column, they earn quite different wages. And so because of these different wages, the cost of migration to these countries are also very different. So for a Filipino domestic worker, if she wants to go to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, it usually only costs her $115, which is really the cost of her passport and medical exam. In contrast, if she wants to go to Canada from the Philippines, it will cost her something like $12,000 to $15,000 to secure her entry. So as I said, across the globe, they share this status as unfree workers. So I want to describe what that means, right? So as I said, across the globe, they have to work only for their sponsor. They have to live with that sponsor. And as I said, in varying degrees, they can never change sponsors. So we see this, for example, in countries like the United Arab Emirates and other Gulf Cooperative Council countries such as Saudi Arabia. In those destinations, migrant domestic workers can only change their job with their employer's permission. So for example, if I'm violated by my employer, like they beat me up and I want to change jobs, I can only change jobs if they say, yes, you can go find another employer. But they don't really want to do that because it usually costs them $3,000 to secure my migration from the Philippines. And so if they put me in another household, they are at risk of losing that $3,000 investment. And so in Singapore, it's also the case that migrant domestic workers cannot change employers without the permission of their current employer. And that's the case even at the end of their 2-year contract. And so this is not the case in Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, they have a little bit more flexibility. There, if I want to change employers, I can, but the problem is I have only 2 weeks to secure a new employer before I can get deported, before I face the risk of deportation. In Taiwan, I can never change my employer, but I can only change my employer if my employer is deemed by the state unable to employ me. And that would happen if they died, if they declared bankruptcy, or if they just moved out of the country. And so we think of places like Israel and Canada as a little bit perhaps more humane because they're quote-unquote Western. But in Israel, they actually historically could not change employers until 2009. But after that year, domestic workers were finally allowed to change their employers, but only 3 times in their first 5 years of employment. And then after staying there for 5 years, they can never change employers again. And in Canada, they can actually only change jobs twice in a span of 4 years. And so, so you could basically see that domestic workers are really constrained. They're unfree workers. And so because of this, they have become sort of the picture of slavery and modern day trafficking, right? Modern day slavery and human trafficking. So how have other scholars examined the status of domestic workers as unfree workers? So they pretty much agree that this can only lead to negative results for the experiences of domestic workers. So one of the earliest scholars to look at domestic workers' status as unfree laborers is Bridget Anderson, looking at the status of domestic workers in Britain, who are also in this situation. She basically says this legal status leads to nothing but a master-slave dynamic in the household, because it makes the domestic worker so dependent on the quote-unquote master that they'll just go beyond what is sort of the regular job of a domestic worker. Kevin Bales, he is the source of this guesstimate that there are 20 million modern-day slaves today, basically sees domestic workers as the quintessential slave of the 21st century. So he can say that because Kevin Bales describes slavery loosely. He basically thinks of slavery as the control of one person by another person for the purpose of their exploitation. And so he says there are three forms of slavery that are occurring today. First is chattel slavery, which is the classic one where you own a person. Second is debt slavery. It primarily happens in South Asia, in which your parents had debt, and then you inherit that debt, and then you can never get out of that debt. And then the third type of slavery, and he says is the most common form of slavery, is what he calls contract slavery. So again, as we see, domestic workers sort of represent that group of contract slaves. And so they're also considered, so Human Rights Watch basically uses the status of domestic workers as unfree workers to say they are nothing but trafficked victims who cannot get out of their employment situation, right? And then finally, the anthropologist Pardis Mahdavi and the sociologist Amrita Pandey basically use the concept of structural violence to underscore how this legal status leads to nothing but harm on the domestic workers. So what I've been doing basically in the last 5 years, is I've been spending time in what we could argue are two worst destinations for domestic workers, and that is the United Arab Emirates and Singapore. So I'm just gonna talk about the United Arab Emirates in this brief talk. And so I wanted to basically see what this legal status of being an unfree worker does to the work conditions of the domestic worker. And so to get to that, what I did was, with my partner, a geographer from the University of Toronto, Rhacel Sylvie, we interviewed 164 Indonesian and Filipino domestic workers who we did not find conveniently. So if anyone has ever been to Dubai, one will know that every single front stage worker that one encounters there is Filipino. And so that was fantastic for me because I'm Filipino. So I could go to all of them and say, where are the domestic workers? So they told me which parks to go to, then I'd go to those parks and there'd be no domestic workers and I'd be crying. So I'd run to Starbucks and I'd say, where's the domestic workers? And they'll say, come at 6 in the morning. That's where the domestic workers are walking the dogs. And so then I would go to parks. I went to food courts on Fridays because that's the day off. I went to migrant shelters where the runaways went to. I went to the migrant neighborhoods where you could find them. And I also went to basically different neighborhoods. And so we were able to get a diverse sample of domestic workers that worked for a variety of employers, Emiratis, other Arabs, Westerners, Filipinos, South Asians. They also included those with a day off, without a day off. They included domestic workers that were undocumented, some were documented, and many more were documented. And then it also included domestic workers that had run away, right? And so then what did we find? We found that not all domestic workers are victimized by their employers, that some actually were very satisfied in their jobs. We found such a variety of employment conditions. We found those with some had a day off, some did not have a day off, some earned more than the minimum wage, some earned less than the minimum wage, some had been working for their employers for 20 years, some had only been working for them for less than 2 years. Some had a day off, others didn't have a day off, some were allowed to work for other households, most were not, some were allowed to have a boyfriend, most were not, some had their phones confiscated, some basically had access to their phones, some slept in the hallway, some slept in their own bed. Some slept in the kitchen with a dog even. And so how do we account for these different varieties? So basically what we can't do is we cannot reduce their experiences to the structures that shape them. We cannot have a functionalist analysis of their experiences, but instead we have to actually recognize this unfreedom as a culturally mediated experience that employers and domestic workers negotiate on an everyday basis. But I think then, so that's one main finding I have. And so the last main finding that I want to share with you is that why do women, they're mostly women, they're pretty much all women, why do they put themselves in this situation of extreme vulnerability, right? So why do they put themselves in such high risk of abuse? And that's particularly the question we should ask for those who end up in the Middle East. And so to get to that question, what we did was we actually spent time in Indonesia and we spent time in the Philippines in which we observed domestic workers through the out-migration process. And what we did was we attended these pre-departure orientation seminars that are required for migrant domestic workers to attend from both countries. And in all those classes that we went to, I'm just going to talk about the Philippines, what was really fascinating was in all those countries we went to, rape was a very common point of discussion. In almost every class we went to, and we observed these classes for about 40 hours, every single teacher brought up the issue of rape and basically told all these domestic workers that they will probably be raped when they get to their country of destination. And this would be like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. So then this actually defies what Andrew Gardner, who writes on construction workers in Kuwait and Qatar, he basically says these Indian construction workers keep on coming back because they don't know what they're going to face there. And that's definitely not the case for these domestic workers that are going to these very vulnerable situations. So for me then, it's like, why do they still go there in the context that they know that they're highly vulnerable? And so as they were getting these stories of rape, I think that question also came up for the teacher, right? And so what was really interesting, and so I just want to share one scenario, one experience I had in which a story of rape, again, was being shared. And then the woman sitting next to me raises her hand. And then she proceeds to describe how she was raped 3 months prior. So she actually was a returned migrant who had been working as a domestic worker in Lebanon. And she, unfortunately, had been raped by the air conditioner repairman 2 weeks before she was scheduled to return to the Philippines. So she decided not to tell her employers what happened because she said it was going to go down to a he said, she said battle in court, and there was going to be no guarantee that she was going to win. And then she also just really wanted to return to the Philippines because she did not want to renew her contract with this employer, but instead what she wanted to do was go to another country. So amazingly, the first place that she went to after she landed in the Philippines after this pretty brutal experience was she immediately went to an employment agency to reprocess her immigration back to a Middle Eastern country. Now she's going to Kuwait. And it was interesting because the teacher asked the students, there were about 70 of them in this very crowded classroom that was probably this size only, and there were 70 of them there. And he asked the students, so does anyone here is anyone here having second thoughts? And then people suddenly said in unison, no. And then one of the women in the back of the class says, each one of us has our own destiny. And we know that not all of us will have her destiny. So it's really important that we pray to God that we do not have her destiny. So it made me rethink, well, it made me question, how do we think about these women who actually place themselves in these highly vulnerable situations that people have tagged modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and structural violence? So we have to actually take into account where they're coming from. Many of them are the poorest of the poor. Many of them lived in huts. My collaborator gets mad at me. She says, it's so offensive to call it a hut. But I'm like, what is it? It's not a wooden structure. It's not a cement house. It's like a house made of leaves. I think technically that's a hut. So they lived in a hut prior to migration with no running water and with no electricity For them, they don't have electricity because in the Philippines, it costs $120 to install electricity. So they cannot install electricity because they do not have $120. Or for them, they'll say, $115 for my passport to go to the Middle East or $120 for my electricity. They go to the Middle East. And so how do they get electricity? So the going rate in the Philippines, in these very remote areas where these women live, is that it costs $2 per item. So if I want a light bulb, then what I do is then I borrow electricity from my neighbor and I pay them $2 a month for that use of that light bulb. An electric fan is $2. The charging of the cell phone is $2. So you can really see that they function in a needs-based economy and they're incredibly impoverished. So for many of them, they have two options in life, right? They have the option of the unfreedom of poverty in the Philippines, or they have the option of the unfreedom of servitude in countries where they're highly vulnerable to abuse, like the United Arab Emirates. And so we have to remind ourselves that they actually choose the unfreedom of servitude, because at least it gives them some mobility that is not possible for them if they stay in the Philippines. So thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. Very rich discussion, and I know probably many of you have a lot of questions. You know, we thought of this as a TED Talk, but this is sort of like the dark underbelly of the TED Talk form, because it's not the, you know, modern global story where everything's great and we're moving forward. I think I'll just start with a question, since that both of you can answer. Since both of you are talking about these movements of migrants, female migrants, male deportees, I wanted you to kind of pull back on a global scale and talk to us a little bit about how the restructuring of labor markets in this global context, what role that has in shaping what's happening with deportation and the migration of domestics.
Sure. Thanks. I probably could spend a long time, but I'll try and be quick about the global restructuring of labor markets in the United States and abroad. Mm-hmm. So one thing to keep in mind is the people who are being deported today are often either they're people who came to the United States to work in our economy, or they're their children. And the people that are being deported today are people that have been coming, are part of migration flows that have been coming to the United States for a long time, and particularly since the 1970s, 1980s. So the United States experienced a rise in immigration in the 1960s, in part due to changes in the law, but then we also have a pretty dramatic increase in migrants to the United States during the 1980s, when the United States is undergoing a restructuring of its own economy. So migrants come to the United States to fill jobs in what we call the new economy in the United States, which is basically jobs in the service industry. So then why do those migrants come why do they leave their country of origin? Like, as Rhacel intimated towards the end, I mean, part of it is poverty, but also it's a very specific, for Latin America, which is where I mostly work, it's a very specific kind of poverty. So a person in Latin America who really lives in a hut and has no access to the global economy is extremely unlikely to migrate, because you really can't, there's no place you can go pay $100 and get anywhere, right? Coming to the United States is relatively expensive. So the migrants that come to the United States are actually people that are working often in some part of the global economy already. So there are people that maybe were living in very poor conditions in rural areas, and then were drawn to urbanized areas to work in the global economy, and then became part of this global migration flow. So so on the one hand, they're working in transnational industries in Latin America, but then they're coming to the United States to support our transnational industries, because they're working, so basically people that work in transnational industries in the United States are lawyers and accountants and global financial managers, and they all go to hotels, they go to restaurants, they have nannies, they have gardeners, and those jobs are being filled by immigrants. So when we're thinking about the restructuring of the economy and the relationship of migration to that, you have to think about changes to the economy in Latin America and changes to the economy in the United States. And that sort of forms the basis for their initial migration. And then deportation is basically the other end of it. Well, as the United States has undergone this sort of transition to our new economy, which is a much more unequal economy than we've had in the past, we've required an enhanced police force, an enhanced coercive arm of the state in order to kind of control populations. So deportation is a manifestation, a particular kind of manifestation of the coercive arm of the state, which rose in response to changes in the economy in the United States.
So what we're seeing with the global migration of domestic workers, and here I'm talking about those who are seeking and securing a servant visa. So I'm not necessarily talking about the domestic workers who enter informally from Latin America to the US, that they pay a lot of money to coyotes and then they find their jobs here independently. So I'm talking about people who officially enter a country with a servant visa. And so that's more prominent for Kenyans, Ethiopians, and migrants from Asia. So what you're seeing then is the institutionalization of migration. And with this institutionalization of migration, what you're seeing is a shift from a network-based to a market-based migration system. And so I think Latin Americans are still very much entrenched in a network-based system. But elsewhere, this market-based system, what it means is basically migrant domestic workers are not depending on their friends and relatives to secure migration or entry to another country, but instead they're relying on the services of a migrant recruitment agency, which they pay a lot of money to. So depending on where they want to go, they will pay less or more. But what these institutions enable is that it really expands the destinations that these workers can go to. So for example, I can say, I want to go to Hong Kong, and it costs me $3,600 US, but then I can get a wage deduction for 12 months. So what that basically means is I don't get paid a cent for 12 months. So domestic workers who go to Singapore basically get a 3 to 5 month wage deduction to afford the 1,100 fee. So then, but if they go to the Middle East, it only costs $115, like I said, so they have no wage deduction. And so then, so while you see them having a wider range of destinations that they could pick, what this actually also means for them is you see the weakening of community and ties. So because it's not friends and family that are bringing them over, when they end up in their destination, they usually do not know anyone. They usually have no contact with friends and kin. So what it does is it actually aggravates the vulnerability that they are put under by their legal status as unfree laborers.
I have a lot of different questions here, so I think I'll just pick a few of them. Okay, here's the first one. Actually, this was the one I was going to. Okay, for the domestic workers, what are the rates of success defined as, oh, I can't read it, sorry. What are the rates of success or of failure? Is it getting better or worse?
Okay. So, so for migrant domestic workers, if you ask them, so okay, first, as Tanya was saying earlier, we have to just remind ourselves that domestic work is low-wage work. It is very unlikely that they will accumulate wealth. And even if they accumulate wealth, it is likely some disaster is going to hit their family or them, that it will suddenly deplete all their savings that they have. And so they're working in Saudi Arabia, they don't have a day off, so they're not spending their money on anything, they're getting some savings, and then their mother gets cancer, right? Or same thing, then a hurricane hits their village and the roof comes off. And so, in our interviews, it's like one scenario after another of life hitting you from the side and them not having any insurance, any resources, any state support to help them get out of that. It will just deplete all their savings. So it's very, very hard for them to get ahead. But for them, what is success? Success is getting something besides a hut, building a house. For some, it's ensuring that their children will never have to do domestic work. And so for most, it's actually being in a position that their children will never have to work as a domestic worker is what is success for them.
If anybody has a burning question in between, just jump out there, and I'm happy to answer a question on the fly. But I'll just keep reading these questions. So this one's for Tanya, about children with deported parents. What is the U.S. breeding when it deports the fathers and mothers of U.S. citizen children who are abandoned, knowing it was the U.S. government who did that to their family?
If we think about it, it's not the first time in history that we've done that. I think actually, if you wanted to understand the depths of pain that might come from that, you would look at Indian boarding schools in the United States.
Yeah.
And I think, so a lot of people, and so many of you have probably heard about the pains of alcoholism and other sorts of diseases, social diseases that are prevalent in Native American communities. And many people would make a very direct linkage between a lot of the suffering in Native American communities and the boarding schools, which persisted into the mid-20th century. So I think that's one way to think about, what happens when when the government actively separates families, and what kind of consequences we might see from that.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions that are sort of similar, which is for Rhacel. The question about, there's so many other kinds of temporary workers who face a similar kind of exploitation and, similar kinds of conditions. Women who work in nail salons, massage salons from Vietnam, Taiwan, China. Do you see them, are they also free workers? Are they repaying a debt? So sort of the larger context of these kinds of migration.
So the experience of indenture is actually pervasive globally, but people are not necessarily held to indenture by their legal status, but it's the debt that they accumulate to migrate that then. So a lot of undocumented workers have a tremendous amount of debt that they have to pay for, which then makes them unfree workers. But then just sticking to those with the legal status of being an indentured worker, this is actually pervasive across the globe, including the U.S., as you see with workers with H-2 visas. And so those are the temporary farm workers in the U.S. that only can work for the farm that sponsor them, or the people who work at the Trump winery in Virginia. They can only work for that winery, and they can't work for another winery. And so then, so you can imagine the construction workers in the United Arab Emirates. What is different about their situation is that they're less isolated, because then they do have a communal group of workers. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better situation for them. It just means it's different. And so what's interesting is in the United Arab Emirates, in our interviews with employers, when we ask them whether they think of domestic workers as trafficked victims, because that's what the Human Rights Watch reports say, they actually always say no. It's the construction workers that are most oppressed. And so construction workers actually are also bound workers, but the United Arab Emirates changed their law in 2016. So now every worker, except domestic workers, can change their employers without permission. But domestic workers were exempt from that recent change in the kafala system. But for those workers, their dependence on the construction workers, on employers, is really sort of magnified by the housing situation. So a lot of them live in the desert, and then they can never leave that desert. They're picked up to go to work and then taken back to that desert, to the desert where they live. So if they're working for a mid-sized firm, there's a high risk of that mid-sized firm going bankrupt. And so what happens when that mid-sized firm goes bankrupt? The owner goes to the airport and flees the country. But then he never tells people that there's actually people in the desert that live there waiting to be picked up and fed. So when you hear those stories in the media about these abandoned camps, so it's not necessarily the work conditions are like that. It's because there is no system of protection for them under this government that basically, that if this happens, the government can intervene and rescue them, right? There's nothing like that there.
Okay, this is a question for both of you. What is the role of the home state vis-a-vis these migrant flows? So in other words, the home states in Latin America and in the Philippines.
Thank you. So, yes. So in the case of deportations, the home state has to figure out how to handle this new flow of migrants. So in the Central American countries, we're talking about 30 to 50,000 deportees arriving every year. So what that looks like in Guatemala, for example, is 4 to 6 plane loads of deportees arriving into the airport. So they're arriving on chartered flights. So the government of Guatemala has to figure out how to receive these new populations. So they don't just like ignore them. They create, so in Guatemala, they create this whole receiving area for deportees, and they have several government ministries present as the people arrive. So first they have to process them as if they would process any arriving migrant to make sure they're Guatemalan. They test them to make sure that they don't have any communicable diseases or any serious injuries. And then they check their criminal record to make sure that they're not fugitives in Guatemala. And then they give them a sandwich and a juice and a bean sandwich, welcome home. And they play marimba music, sort of again, like welcome home, welcome back. Yeah. And then they give them, if they're from the provinces, they give them a bus ticket to their destination. So the receiving states of deportees have to really kind of organize themselves and figure out how to manage this flow, this new migrant, this unanticipated migrant flow. Mm.
So in the case of migrant domestic workers, a question we could ask is, so what type of social contract do sending states maintain with the citizenry that they deploy to what they know are highly vulnerable situations, right? And so other scholars that preceded me basically say that the sending state does nothing but commodify these workers and deploy them. I do think that's a little bit like inaccurate, because what sending states feel is that these are workers who are deciding to go there. And so what we need to do is then help facilitate this process for them. And so of all these different countries, many commend the Philippines, and I would actually say rightfully commend the Philippines. So the Philippines actually has a pretty robust protectionist program. Its effects are not always positive, but some are. And so they do many things. They try to educate the women prior to migration. A second thing that they do is they try to set up bilateral agreements with countries, because what's going on is domestic workers are ending up in countries without any labor protection whatsoever, without any labor standards whatsoever. And so the sending state tries to create some type of standard prior to migration. And then what they also do is they actually have scholarships for the children of these migrant workers, and they also actually have a lot of reintegration classes. I mean, some of these reintegration classes are pretty like patronizing, like balloon making classes, or but some are skills training, like how to bake a cake, or how to use a sewing machine, but they're not high skill classes that they try to teach the migrant domestic workers for potential reintegration.
Is it a related question? Okay, real quick.
I've heard that Mexico is threatening not to accept deportees from the U.S., and I know that they have to accept them. Are they actually pushing back against Trump's policies in that way?
I mean, it's interesting because Mexico, among our migrant sending and deportee receiving countries, does have a fair amount of power on the global stage, but not really in the face of the United States. So So thinking about the geopolitics is really important when thinking about migration. Like these people, migrants are coming to the United States because of the position of the United States in the global economy, and that position of the United States in the global economy gives the United States a lot of power in negotiating. So, of course, Mexico, the government of Mexico, and many Mexican citizens are unhappy with how the President of the United States has portrayed their nation and sort of talked about the country. But unfortunately, countries who have tried to sort of question the power of the United States on the global stage, things have not turned out that well. So I mean, Mexico can sort of posture, but I think the reality of it is that the United States has negotiated a lot of trade agreements and other sort of international accords with Mexico and many other countries that puts the United States in a very powerful position, and Mexico's just not really, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, Santa Cruz can be really mad at Sacramento and but there's like really limits to what you can do as a county, right, in the face of California. So sort of thinking about it that way, and then of course Santa Cruz is in California, but still kind of, there are these real power dynamics in place. So Mexico is not really in a position to just say, we're not going to accept any deportees. I mean, the United States sends a lot of funding to Mexico. For example, the United States is funding a very violent war on drugs in Mexico that is also kind of part of this story of repression and fleeing in Mexico. So there's a lot of people that are interested in the United States continuing to send lots of money and guns and military training and equipment to Mexico. So that's just one example of the kind of thing that Mexico is not necessarily willing to give up just to kind of say, like, we're not going to take deportees.
Okay, we have two more questions. So we are continuously critiquing the poverty that individuals aim to escape by seeking these labor opportunities abroad. But how are these countries people are going to further fomenting poverty and oppression? Are these receiving countries being checked by international human rights organizations?
So, okay, I think that question is directed to me. And so then, so migrant domestic workers are going to many countries, half of which actually have no labor protection for domestic workers, and half of which has labor protection. So when we think about those with labor protection, we imagine them to be all the Western countries, but no, that's not necessarily the case. So for example, in Israel, they made domestic workers exempt from the work and rest law in 2009. And so then Jordan actually has labor protection for its domestic workers. Not Taiwan, Hong Kong has labor protection for their domestic workers, but Singapore does not. And so what's interesting is that despite the absence of labor protection, we are seeing the emergence of standards. But these standards are not necessarily legislated by the receiving governments, but what they are standards that emerge from the moral values and the cultural beliefs of employers. So how do we then mobilize those moral values and cultural beliefs? So many stakeholders are trying to do that. And so those stakeholders include organizations such as Human Rights Watch, the International Labor Organization, the U.S. Department of State with their U.S. Trafficking in Persons report, and also sending states. They try to mobilize that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, with the Philippines and their efforts to create bilateral agreements, and also in the efforts of the Philippines to educate their domestic workers on what are humane standards of employment that they should expect in the context of going to countries with no labor standards whatsoever. And so we could call those stakeholders moral entrepreneurs that are basically operating outside. You know, some of them are trying to advocate for laws to be passed. Some of them are trying to embarrass employers through media campaigns. But some of them are trying to empower domestic workers directly to lobby. And so what's very interesting is that there's actually a new change in the law in the United Arab Emirates. So now they're opening what they're calling tadbir centers, which basically requires domestic workers to go through a seminar before they enter their households in the UAE. And so they're basically given their basic rights. So that they at least know what they should be facing to lessen the likelihood of abuse. And then in Singapore and other destinations, employers actually have to take a class that they have to pass before they can employ a domestic worker. And I took that class and I took the test and I barely passed because the test was so hard because it was all on nutrition. It was like all on nutrition and like, what is like, a good meal per day, vitamins and all. I mean, it was crazy, right? Like, and I think the point was if you're an employer, you should feed your domestic worker. You
put up a chart earlier that showed a relationship between how much money you can make and what it costs to get the job. And it sounds like there might also be a relationship between how much you pay and how likely you are to encounter protections of your labor. That you say it's very inexpensive to get to the UAE and there's the least amount there. Is that true? There's sort of a new concept of protection money and the modification of their able to access protection.
So it's interesting because I think the cost of migration is really determined by the wages. The wages of that domestic workers will earn. And a lot of domestic workers, I must say, are savvy, and that many of them, they define part of their job as gaining the trust and emotional attachment of their employers. And so then their job, when you ask them what their job is, they don't just say, I take care of this child, I clean the house. But part of what they strategically try to do on a daily basis is to gain the trust and to secure emotional attachment from their employers, because they say that is the best way to secure higher standards of labor in the context that there are no labor standards for their type of employment.
Did you want to add to that? Okay. Well, this last question, sort of, you're already answering part of it, but maybe both of you can think of it, even though it's directed to Rhacel. What are the possibilities for domestic workers to organize themselves to fight for more protections? And can't we analyze their condition through a capitalist framework, regardless of the fact that they have varied experiences? They're all subject to the power their employers hold. Yeah, so you started answering.
Well, so in terms of empowering domestic workers, you have trade unions in certain countries that try to mobilize domestic workers, and we see that only in Lebanon, really, but in Italy, but in other countries, it's difficult because there's no civic engagement in the highest destinations of domestic workers, and that's the Middle East. And so then it's very difficult to mobilize them collectively because they are also isolated in these private households. And so then, so one big question is how do you empower them in the context that you can't do collective protest, right? And then in the context that you don't really have any legislative protection. And so what we found was that domestic workers actually are very much empowered when they are educated prior to migration of their rights, and that those rights that they're given are really based on a particular sort of moral standards of humanity that the sending state tells them that they should have. Like people should eat 3 meals a day. People should, have access to soap, and, people should be able to talk to their loved ones on the phone, those kinds of basic rights that they are potentially denied by employers. And so what we found was that domestic workers in light of the absence of collective protest and in light of the absence of legislation, they actually mobilize morality through their daily interactions with employers. And they actually will tell an employer, if an employer is not feeding them, you know, I'm a human being, I should get fed 3 times a day. And that actually happened to one of our interviewees that was not fed more than once a day by their employer. And she told us this story that she talked to the male employer and said, to the female employer first and said, oh, you have to feed me more than once a day or else I'll die. And then the female employer is like, dogs only eat once a day, so why do you need to eat more than once a day? And then she goes to the male employer and tells the male employer the same thing, and the male employer is like, well, if you die, I don't care. You're not Emirati, so I'll just put you in the garbage can. You're from the Philippines, right? So in that case, I mean, what was interesting about it is that she actually spoke to them. Like, she didn't just sit there and say, they're not feeding me, so I'm just gonna wallow here and die, right? She's like, I am gonna tell them I'm a human being, go feed me. And so unfortunately for her was that they didn't really see her as a human being, so she ran away. But a lot of times, when they tell them, feed me, they'll feed them, right? And so, so that's one way that you empower them, is by educating them. Oh, there's a hand over there.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'll also respond to this question. So international migration is happening in the context of a globally integrating capitalist economy. So that's just important to keep in mind, because what that means is global integration, global economic integration produces migration. But why does it produce migration? It produces migration because it integrates people into the capitalist economy, gives them some resources, and then kind of produces the networks that allow migration. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's because, so you want to also remember, like, why did the Ford auto plant close down in Detroit in the first place? Right? Well, it closed down in Detroit in the first place because profits were falling, and there was an opportunity to move the auto manufacturing plant to Mexico, where wages were cheaper. And then, so the fact that wages are cheaper in Mexico is also the reason why people are coming to the United States. So all of it, so basically migration is happening in the context of global inequality and an integrating global economy. And that's important to keep in mind, because if we did have, if we really did have like a free market for labor around the world, then it's probably the case that we would have less inequality, right? So this migration is happening to get people, individual people kind of a leg up in the globally integrated economy. But if we had a completely open border with Mexico, it's probably the case that there would be less inequality between the United States and Mexico. So we don't have an open border, and since we don't have an open border, we need deportations, right? Like you need the possibility to deny people entry and to remove people who have entered illegally in order to retain this inequality, this global inequality. So deportation is part of this system of global inequality. It sustains global inequality, or it's required in an unequal world.
Okay, well, thank you. So I know, Dana, sorry, Kat is telling me we are out of time. Okay.
We have time to linger for a little bit. I just want to thank everyone for coming here this evening, taking time out of your busy schedules to be here, to talk about this very important subject. And I want to thank
Felicity, thank you. And our visitors, Rhacel and Tanya, for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us and share their expertise. It's been a real pleasure having you. And again, we can linger for a little while here, but I do want to give people who need to go home after 8 p.m. the opportunity to do so. So thank you again, and clrc.ucsc.edu. Thank you.